Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our National Hispanic Heritage Month conversation. Today's discussion is entitled Innovation Through Inclusion. Pedro Espinoza on diversity in business, tech, and beyond. It's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest today, Pedro Espinoza. We're incredibly proud to have Pedro as a member of our Board of Trustees here at Notre de Namur University, where his leadership and dedication to innovation really shine. Pedro's a man of many talents, a TED speaker, entrepreneur, author, and AI investor. He founded SmileyGo, a groundbreaking platform that helped companies make smarter investments by indexing data from over 1.3 million NGOs across 30 countries. His impact doesn't stop there. In 2018, Pedro founded Pan Peru USA, a venture that empowers women entrepreneurs and has scaled from supporting just one woman to over 100. Pedro's achievements have been recognized globally, from receiving the UC Entrepreneur Winner Award to being named one of the 40 under 40 in Silicon Valley this year. His journey is a testament to grit and the power of inclusion. He is the author of two influential books, Differences That Make a Difference and the Real ROI, Return on Inclusion, which feature contributions from some of the world's leading CEOs. His story is not only one of remarkable success, but also of deep commitment to social impact, having given 3,000 children access to STEM education through Pan Peru and reforesting 15,000 trees. Please join me in welcoming our guest, Pedro Espinoza.
Thank you, President. So, super honored to be here and great seeing many Board of Trustees members and friends and part of the Notre Dame de Namur community. So we want to make this as interactive as possible and super honored to serve on the Board of Trustees. So thank you, Beth, for the kind words.
Sure, thank you, Pedro, for being here. So let's start with some definitions to level set. How would you define diversity, inclusion, and innovation, and are they related?
Wow, great questions. Number one, I would say diversity is any difference that makes a difference. And that's why we named the first book Differences That Make a Difference, because I'm a huge believer that diversity of thought, diversity of background, obviously gender, ethnic diversity are more obvious, but today in not only corporate America, but in NGOs and universities, you see diversity of generations, diversity of background and education. Inclusion is more of making sure that these folks and people get included in the conversation. There's a quote, I believe it's Verna Myers, who said, diversity is inviting everyone to the party, and inclusion is asking them to dance in the party. And then innovation comes to like entrepreneurship and making people think differently. In business school, you always learn that for a startup, you need a hacker, a hustler, and an artist. A hacker being the person who builds the product, the MVP, the hustler being the person who hires people, raises capital, brings investor, and the artist being like the UI, UX, architect, nitty-gritty details. So you need all these components to foster entrepreneurship and create inclusive, innovative startups.
Thanks, Pedro.
Yeah.
One of the things you say in the book is that the authors almost accept diversity as given if you have two or more people. Are you suggesting that all of the efforts of our recruiting teams to identify a pipeline of female and underrepresented talent isn't needed? How would that align with the insights from Jenna Nichols that talent is evenly distributed, but opportunity is not? Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, no, excellent remarks, President Beth. I think opportunities, unfortunately, in the US and the world, right, like many times it really shapes the zip code you were born in. And I'm a huge believer of sponsorship from my research the last 5 years with different companies like Google, NVIDIA, Microsoft, and Tesla. I've seen that a lot of women and people of color, Hispanics, Latinas, Latinos, we tend to be over-mentored, yet under-sponsored. And what do I mean by this is a lot of people tend to give us advice, which is great. We need mentors in our careers, in university and graduate school. But sponsors are the ones who are wearing your shirt when you're not there. In the boardroom, in the hiring room, in the room where promotions happen. And so if we want to be intentional with inclusion, we need to have more sponsors and people who have the skin in the game and not only give you financial capital, Beth, but also social capital and open their network so you could do your startup or go to law school or go to business school or medical school or pursue whatever your passion is.
Thanks, Pedro. How can organizations and leaders encourage more diversity? What are some of the best practices you've seen?
One example I love is language. Like how we say things matters a lot. And one of the interviews in the first book, Differences That Make a Difference, I see some people have the book, is Anita Sands, who used to serve on the board of trustees at Princeton, and she's on the board of Pure Storage and Service now here in Santa Clara. Pre-COVID, the number one question they asked when it came to recruiting board members, they asked candidates, have you been the CEO of a Fortune 500 company? And that question already discards the vast majority of women and people of color. And they switched the semantics and the lexicon to, have you managed a P&L that's equivalent to a Fortune 500 company? And then you find more women, African Americans, Latin Americans, Hispanic Americans who happen to be the CEO of Toyota Latin America or AT&T business, right? Like they might not be the CEO of the whole publicly traded company, but they are the head of a huge division that has the P&L of a Fortune 500. And then you get more veterans, refugees, people from different underrepresented communities, and you sponsor them.
Thanks. Are certain types of diversity more important than others? Can you speak specifically to generational diversity, given demographics are destiny, with 60% of the global population being Gen X, Y, and Z? Maybe share some personal experiences in this regard and tips for managers, whether they are Gen X, Y, Z, managing older people or the other way around.
Yeah, I'm a big believer when it comes to bilateral mentorship. I think you don't need a title to be a leader, and you don't have to be a CEO to help another CEO. Yes, we all know that millennials are the largest segment of the labor force today, and Gen Zs are already working in the labor force in the US and beyond. I think research shows that Gen Zs and millennials, like the younger generations, we tend to really appreciate feedback a lot, and we also love having a mentorship route within the organization. If companies and organizations and universities can tie the specific tasks and duties of the Gen Zs to the vision of the university or the corporation, you tend to do a better job in retaining younger talent.
Thank you. Some experts have said that inclusion is mainly a set of behaviors that create an environment that enables people to feel respected for who they are, that they feel heard, that they are encouraged to participate to their fullest potential. So primarily, inclusion is seen by some as a perception or feeling. Do you agree?
I think inclusion goes beyond than a feeling. I think the whole purpose of inclusion is creating an environment where people can bring their whole self to work and a sense of belonging, because humans, we want to feel heard. We all have a story to share. And this is something I always share at companies and universities when it comes to gaining mentors, gaining investors, is sharing your personal story, being relational over transactional, Beth. And I always share this story at Berkeley because I did undergrad in the East Bay. I was at the Golden Bear Cafe. I'm assuming many of us have been to Berkeley, most people, yes. And I see this like 80-year-old business person wearing a suit, and my mom in Spanish in Peru, she raised me saying, "Júntate con los mejores," which means surround yourself with the wisest or the best. And this gentleman was eating by himself, and so I'm like, okay, I'm gonna sit next to him and grab breakfast next to him. And I was like, what is your name? Can I sit next to you? He's like, my name is Frank Baxter. And I said, Frank, why are you here? Everyone seems to be a freshman or a sophomore. You seem to be very wise. And he said, well, I'm on the board of trustees at UC Berkeley Foundation. The board of directors meeting got a bit delayed. I was hungry. I wasn't going to drive. I'm eating a sandwich. And so I'm immediately like, wow, this is so cool. I've never met a trustee at any university. I was 18 at the time, Beth. And we start this conversation. And immediately I see that Frank was wearing a U.S. pin. You know those flags? A U.S. flag here and a flag from Uruguay. And I was like, why are you wearing a Latin American flag on your suit? And he said, well, Pedro, I used to serve as the U.S. ambassador to Uruguay under President Bush. And so then we start speaking in Spanish, right? So two people from different generations, ethnicities, mother tongues, religions, just different everything. But we bonded over Spanish. Gave me his business card. 2 years later, you can guess who was the first person to write a check and invest in Smiley Go. And then 5 years later, can you guess who was the first CEO for Differences That Make a Difference, the book that some of you are holding? It was him. He was the CEO of Jeffries. So it's all like relationships, 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 and being in tension when it comes to building inclusion.
Thank you. You start chapter 2 with some great questions about inclusion. What effect does the practice of inclusion have on the ability of the business to grow?
Oof, so many benefits. One of my favorite statistics and facts is 44% of Fortune 500 companies were started by immigrants and or their children. And one of the reasons why Silicon Valley and the Bay Area is so innovative and so successful is because we represent over 115 nationalities here in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I'm a huge believer that the more differences in backgrounds in education and ethnicities and diversity of thought, the more teams can be more disruptive when it comes to new technologies.
So is it possible to demonstrate how that affects the bottom line?
Yeah, there are many. There are several studies by McKinsey, by Deloitte, when it comes to Fortune 2000, Fortune 500 companies, that usually companies that have more female and people of color in their leadership team, they tend to be in the upper quartile when it comes to EBITDA.
And how about success at innovation?
In startups, I think we see them all around here in Y Combinator in San Francisco, at Skydeck in Berkeley, at Stardex at Stanford. We see a lot of cross collaboration when it comes to teamwork. A lot of startups that I personally invest and see have usually a PhD student with an undergrad, with a master's student, or a visitor scholar from like Oxford. So I just love seeing teams that are built with people in different backgrounds and stages of life. I think when we have differences in a team, they can bring their own success ideas and they're aligned by the same values and principles.
Thanks. So can you have too much inclusion? How do you know when you have enough?
Great question. I don't think you can have too much. I mean, of course, we want to level the playing field and want to make sure, Beth, that everyone can voice their concerns or their questions. Obviously, I believe in leadership, and in business you have hierarchy. There's only usually one CEO, one CFO, one COO. But I think it's important to understand that there's a long way to go when it comes to inclusion, right? I think as of 2023, there were more CEOs named John than the total number of female CEOs in the United States. And there are many publicly traded companies that up to only like 2021 lacked a Hispanic in their board of directors, especially here in California. It's like 41% Hispanic or even more. And so there's a long way to go when it comes to representation.
How about the same question for innovation? Can you ever have enough?
I don't think so. I mean, I love new startups and ideas. I love brainstorming. I think the best ideas sometimes are the worst. A good professor, her name is Tina Seelig at Stanford, she always encourages students and faculty members to not write a CV or a resume on success, but write your CV on failures. Because it is through failures that we learn what didn't work and we can flip the strategy. And I can share one failure I've done, Beth. When I was 21, many of us go to conferences, I'm sure, all of us. I had the business card of Ron Gonzalez. He used to be the mayor of San Jose. And so, like many of us, I was not best friends with the mayor, but I had his contact information on my phone. And one day I texted the wrong Ron. So my Bible study leader from church, he's also RG, like the same initials. And one day I was like, hey man, like when are we playing soccer after church? Or I'm gonna buy a Costco chicken wings. Like being human, being friendly, right? And then the mayor replied with the question mark on iMessage. And I was like, he's gonna unfriend me on LinkedIn, he's gonna think I'm weird. But I took this error as an opportunity to start a conversation with the mayor. And I asked him like, well, what sports do you play? And he was like, well, I hike the dish at Stanford with my wife. And since I mentioned church, I asked him like, do you pray? Do you meditate? He's like, yeah, I go to mass in St. Leo Cathedral in San Jose. So Beth, we started this conversation out of my mistake. And to accelerate the story, we ended up grabbing coffee in Starbucks a few months later, and then I asked him to join the board of directors of Smiley Go. And many people ask, how did you get San Jose Water Company as a customer? How'd you get Google to use your software? How'd you get Dropbox? Well, it was through Ron Gonzalez, right? He was the mayor of San Jose and knew everybody in Silicon Valley.
And he was on our
trustee.
yeah.
Yeah.
There you go.
He used to serve. Yes, yes, yes. Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for getting him.
You're welcome. I think he's a great human, great leader. Yeah.
Can inclusion lead to groupthink? How can managers guard against groupthink yet still provide psychological safety, which we know is critical for innovation in their teams?
Great question. I'm a big believer, Beth, that mid-management is where rubber meets the road. Many times, a lot of universities, companies, nonprofits, we tend to focus too much on just the C-suite. Personally speaking, I've seen companies like Fortune 500 companies, especially in the Midwest, I'm not going to name a few, that happen to have a female COO or a brown person, African American, Latin American as the CEO. And then they think just because they have a female or Latino CEO, CFO, that's going to fix everything, but that's not going to fix everything. They forget to do professional development sessions like this, having an open conversation of cultural intelligence, equity, inclusion, belonging, because it is mid-management. Those are the leaders that are going to sponsor and promote the future Beths, the future Bens, the future Pedros, the future Jeans, the future, the next generation of leaders. And if mid-managers aren't equipped with the tools of being champions of inclusion, you can't expect the CEO or COO to do everything. And so I'm a big believer that mid-management is where they're going to steward the next generation of diverse leaders.
Thanks, Pedro. One of my favorite topics is innovation, so let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
What do you think are the top 3 or 4 things that leaders can do to foster in an organization innovation?
Excellent, excellent questions. I'm a big believer. I love brainstorming sessions when it comes to specific teams. I've seen it different, especially tech companies. We live a few miles away from Meta and NVIDIA and Tesla and all these big tech companies. The more you can have in your weekly hurdle meetings, 5 or 10 minute sessions for everybody to share a Kaizen. And I'm sure many of you would know, like a continuous improvement, like asking them, hey, what specific method or process in our team could we do to increase efficiency or reduce costs? And especially being intentional, Beth, in hearing the introverted people in the room, because yes, it's easier for extroverted people to raise their hands and share their ideas. I think that's one positive externality of COVID, because in the past, for very extroverted humans, it's easy for us to stand up and knock the cubicle or the office or someone, ask for help, share an idea. But like 2021, 2022, when things are hybrid, everything's on Teams or Slack or email or Google or whatever intranet you use. And for people who are on the shyer side, they can just send a message on Slack or Teams and be like, hey, can you teach me this? Or hey, I have feedback for this. Or hey, why don't we try this new strategy, A/B testing, BC testing. So I think COVID has sort of leveled the playing field for more introverted people to share their ideas when it comes to brainstorming and innovation.
I think we see that too in online learning. That's what some teachers are learning.
Mm-hmm.
Does inclusion or does innovation get harder with increased diversity? Any lessons that particularly resonated from the interviews or suggestions to people on how to manage conflict when it arises from diversity? We have a lot of passionate people in this country.
We do, and I think in this country we need, and I pray for more unity. I think unfortunately our country tends to be more and more polarized, and I was born and raised in Peru, as you all know, so I just wish we had more diplomacy, that both people on both sides could agree to disagree. It's so important to voice our backgrounds and our faiths and our cultural upbringings, but it's as important to respect the other person's beliefs and traditions and habits, right? The US is a country of immigrants, and I think one really impressive thing that I see companies do today when it comes to inclusion and belonging is create faith resource groups, like interfaith employee resource groups. I know we're a Catholic university and I love that, but for example, Salesforce in San Francisco, they have an employee resource group called Faith Force, where they bring people from Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, Christian, Catholic backgrounds together to do community service in the Tenderloin district. And Mark Benioff, who's the founder of Salesforce, gave praise to Faith Force because he said this is true inclusion, right? Is bringing people from different parts of the world, you know, South America, Middle East, Oceania, forgetting about their specific faiths, but focusing on helping the homeless. And I think that's the best, when you agree to disagree and you decide to love your sister, love your neighbor as yourself, and be intentional in helping your local community. And that's something I'm a big believer on, and I think we need more of that today.
Thank you. What are some of the best practices for employee resource groups, and what role do they play in helping to build a more inclusive culture?
Excellent questions. For employee resource groups, what I see what works, Beth, is cross-collaboration. Sometimes bad things can happen even when teams and leaders have good intentions. I've personally seen in other large tech companies that sometimes, I'm giving examples, like the Latino, the Latin ERG, they don't want to share the best sales practices with the veterans group. Or the women's group, they don't want to share this with the other ones. You don't have to be to belong, and that's why executive sponsorship and champions are so important, because we need everyone to cross-collaborate. And what I've seen the best practices is when there's like Women's History Month in March or Hispanic Heritage Month, September, October, we see different parts of the companies of groups working together to celebrate diversity, rather than them working here in silos and the other people here. It's important to be together, Beth, but also to tie it to the business strategy. I've seen how sometimes a company like, I'm not naming AT&T, but like a company like in the telecommunications industry, all they do for Hispanic Heritage Month is a taco party and salsa dancing. I love tacos and I love dancing, but it's also important to connect it with the OKRs and KPIs of the company, maybe bicultural marketing, maybe cultural intelligence when it comes to doing AT&T ads for the Hispanic market, right? So you have to tie it to the business or to the university or to the nonprofit's mission. You can't just have tacos for the sake of having tacos. So.
Thanks, Pedro. Mm-hmm. What were some of the most interesting learnings for you from the interviews you did for your book? Any differences of note between tech companies and non-tech companies?
One of my favorite interviews was with Carol Christ, who served as the chancellor of Berkeley, and I believe she retired recently.
Right.
She was sharing back in 2017-18, they had a campaign to foster entrepreneurship in Berkeley called I Am a UC Entrepreneur. And she was sharing, Beth, that with that specific lingo and diction, it was about 65-70% male applicants and 30-35% female applicants. And then she said later they wanted it to be a bit more 50-50, right? And they changed the wording, the lexicon, to I am a UC change maker, rather than I'm a UC entrepreneur. And that subtle change, one would think it's just one word, leveled it a bit from 70 to 30, it went to 55-45, because more female students at UC Berkeley felt more attached and more relatable to the word change maker rather than the word entrepreneur. And that explains just the power of language, right? What we say matters, how we say things matters even more. Excuse me, because if we want to be more inclusive, we have to be aware of the cultural differences here in the US. And I'll finish with this idea, especially for many of us who come from Latin American countries, or even I think in Asian countries as well, we tend to come from more of a community, like family-centric demographics, and many times we say we a lot. And perhaps that's why we don't get as promoted as other groups, because we don't give credit to ourselves. We're like, oh yeah, we reached the sales goal, we hired this specific person, But it's also important if you did it and you say, hey, I was the one who reached the sales quota, or I was the one who hired this person for the board or whatever. So it's important to use I when you're the one doing it so you could get credit as well.
Thanks. What advice do you have for hiring managers who are eager to achieve diversity, equity, and inclusion and innovation in their teams?
When it comes to hiring, two things. One, the pipeline. This might seem silly or funny for many of you, but I've met hiring people in tech specifically who complain that they don't find, to be direct, like black and brown talent, but they're only searching at the Stanfords and like MITs and like, Harvards. And of course, you're not going to find, Stanford is not 50% Latino. It's just not the reality, right? And so you have to be intentional in scouting and searching for talent where you want to see results. Right? You can't be super narrow-minded. And same thing with African-American talent. You have to partner with HBCUs and Hispanic serving institutions, HSIs, because I think talent is everywhere, Beth. And I think we're seeing the next generation of unicorns that not necessarily come from Silicon Valley, but up and rising places like Austin or Florida or Tennessee or New Jersey, where you don't have to have an MIT or Stanford degree to create the most innovative companies. And hiring managers should be aware that they need to be intentional in searching beyond the quote-unquote great STEM engineering schools.
Right. Thanks, Pedro. What would you say to managers who think they are in a very specialized field and require a very narrow set of skills, so the pool of candidates for them to hire from is quite limited? How to balance hiring needs of the business today versus what you're going to need in 5 years, especially in the midst of a business boom?
Well, when it comes to specific technical skills, especially with Gen AI and LLMs today, things change exponentially, rapidly fast. What people learned 5 or 10 years ago in machine learning decision trees, today, to be very candid, is pretty much irrelevant. And I'm a big believer that AI will continue to grow exponentially. So I would focus as a hiring manager on the emotional intelligence of candidates, on the soft skills. In my mind, it's way harder to teach someone how to be a CEO, how to embrace empathy, how to embrace cultural intelligence, how to embrace patience, how to embrace good listening skills, than teaching someone how to do Python or JavaScript or RStudio. Don't take me wrong, like Java and like Python, they're extremely important, Beth, but I think having a team player who can actually communicate her or his ideas and pitch the startup idea and negotiate and convey a message and give a TED Talk is way harder than having someone learn JavaScript on Coursera or YouTube for 3 months. I think the next generation of tech companies and universities and leaders have to focus on the soft skills. Just because today we see Gen AI and all these algorithms creating algorithms by themselves, and so we need to focus more on the human aspect of leadership, on the empathy. I believe that CEOs are truly chief empathy, chief emotional officers, rather than just a chief executive officers. They're extremely great listeners and have an amazing memory, which leads me to my next story. When I was writing the Real ROI, Return on Inclusion, I had the opportunity of interviewing Michael Dell, and we met during COVID in 2021. I'm sure you all remember Zoom had the 40-minute free version, and for many of these interviews with Michael Dell or Eric Schmidt or Sue J. King, I only asked for 10-minute windows because these are extremely, extremely busy leaders. But I would find a way to connect with them on a human level and ask about their family, their hobbies, their sports, their habits, and so forth. And with Michael, we bonded because he shared how he dropped out of UT Austin and his parents were very upset at him and his cultural upbringing. And I shared how, because of my mom's Parkinson's, I had to drop out of an academic quarter at Stanford, and just family backgrounds as well with him. And long story short, he started asking me questions about Peru because as of 2021, Michael Dell had never been to Peru. And then we got kicked out of my Zoom meeting room. And so Michael Dell had to re-enter my personal Zoom link because I had the free version. And he laughed because he was like, aren't you like a Berkeley like entrepreneur, successful TED speaker? I was like, yes, Michael, but we have the immigrant hustle of being resourceful and being frugal, right? Being good stewards. And the funniest thing is this year when I went to Davos, I ran into Michael Dell at the World Economic Forum, and he remembered that. He was like, oh, you're the guy from Peru who's helping women with the alpaca business and your Zoom. So I was just impressed how many of these CEOs have really, really good memories and are great listeners and are great BS detectors as well. So if you want to build your personal board of mentors, keep it real. You know, be vulnerable, be authentic, and make sure to share a very personal story that people can connect. Yeah.
Well, you're a very great role model, and I want to thank you for coming here today. It's really been a pleasure, and we will see you again soon.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much, everyone.